Welcome to the Writer's Mind Podcast, Episode 3. All right, welcome to another episode. Today, what I want to talk about is something that is hotly debated over and over again in screenwriting circles, which is this idea of, is there screenwriting rules that actually matter? Is there screenwriting principles that actually matter? Or are rules simply made to be broken and you should do whatever you want in regards to your story? And this idea really, I think, comes down to the idea or the question of, is there objectivity in art and writing? Because when you're asking the question, do screenwriting rules and principles matter? What you're asking is there an objective standard of art that is obvious to humans? And if there is an objective standard of art, what is that standard? What does that look like? And can you identify that? And do the rules and principles that we have in regards to storytelling actually show and represent those core those core objectives, or that core objectivity in regards to storytelling and in regards to art? And so I think that the best way to look at this is looking back through history and thinking about what the greats in art in general did, right? I think you have to come back and before you're even looking at storytelling, I think you also have to look at art as a larger concept, because I would say that while storytelling is in some ways its own thing, it also exists under the umbrella of art. And I think that what you find is kind of how what something, you can recognize something like a piece of art that is good or great, but you're not always able to identify why, right? But there is a way for you to look at something and say, okay, this is great or good for these reasons, and this piece over here is not great or not good for some reason. And so really, I think what it comes down to is, if you're looking at a piece of art, a lot of times, you can prescribe meaning onto it. Like a lot of modern art ends up working that way, where you are, as someone who doesn't know the intention of the artist, you are then, placing your own interpretation onto that piece of art. And many times that is the intention of that piece of art. But I would say that a lot of times when that happens, you end up with something that can just be anything, right? And I think one of the things that we can identify with as mattering is that I think there is legitimacy to the idea that you can look at something and understand that it has a specific intention behind it, and then you begin judging it on how well it achieved that intention, right? There's this big question that I think also comes into this discussion on objectivity in art and writing, where you have to ask, does the intention of the artist or the writer matter when you get to the interpretation, when you get to the phase of presenting that piece of art or presenting that storytelling to an audience? Does the intention of the initial artist matter? Some people would say that it is only up to the audience to make their own interpretations and, create their own claims on what this particular piece of art was saying. I think you could also look at it and say, well, an artist creating a piece of art has specific intention behind wanting to create that piece of art. Therefore, their ability to correctly convey their point or their intention matters to how well that intention is portrayed. So, and I would take a stand on this, and I would say that the intention of the artist or storyteller matters heavily, and I believe should matter heavily to the audience and to that piece of art. And I think that, in my opinion, the best case scenario or the best situation that you want to be in as somebody who is trying to write or create art is that when you have something to say, when you want the audience to come away from your story or your piece of art with a particular idea or a thought or something to ponder or a philosophical viewpoint, that you are able to correctly communicate that idea to them through that piece of art. I think that somebody who is actually creating art will hold that opinion, because I think that if you are creating art and you have something to say, but nobody ever picks up on what you're trying to say, and you end up with all of these people with wildly different interpretations that aren't even close to your original intention, to me that seems discouraging. To me that seems that you are missing the mark. To me that seems like you're creating bad art. Now, you can also create art without a specific intention. You can create art for art's sake. You can create art because you simply want to create something. And there's a ton of legitimacy in that. But it's hard. But it seems like that's an entirely other realm of art, right? If you look at a thriller or a horror film that specifically exists to scare and thrill the audience, that story has a different intention than a story that is trying to say something or is holding an idea or is trying to communicate a particular philosophical viewpoint or philosophical conflict through a story. You can have a story that is only about jump scares and tension and thrills, and I love a lot of those. That's a great way to send an audience on a fun ride. But that's what it is. It is a fun ride. It's not necessarily something that the audience is going to walk away from a particular story and say, this film was heavily impactful to how I view the world, or I took away from this film like a philosophical question, or the storytellers who created this film tried to say something through this work. And this idea of saying something also gets heavily involved in this argument, right? This whole idea of, is there objectivity to art and writing? A lot of people will hear me say that a particular artist or writer is trying to say something through their art and say, wow, that is preachy, or that is heavy-handed, or that is not the objective of art. And I would just radically disagree. I think that there is a large prevailing idea that I feel like I've encountered a lot, both kind of in film school and just in the general, screenwriting sphere, which is this idea that, your themes or what you're trying to say, if you're trying to say anything at all, should not come from any sort of intention on your part. It should come completely organically by you telling a particular story, and then suddenly it's filled with this, well-created, organic theme. And I just completely disagree with this idea. And I know that a lot of people are going to disagree with me on that. And please feel free to, comment below if you're viewing this on YouTube, or if you are in the Discord. If you're in the Patreon Discord, please start up a discussion about this, because I just radically disagree with this idea at all. I mean, I think it's the same kind of idea where people talk about, like, this trickles down into this other idea of, having structure, having specific character change over time, understanding certain principles of storytelling, understanding momentum, understanding the flow and the beats of conflict, and understanding how to create points of tension and turning points and these sorts of things, where people will look at that and say, no, you should not try to do that. Your story should just be completely organic. Your story should be simply an organic expression of what is in your mind. I feel like that becomes the core view. And then you get to the end of that, and then you say, you have a finished product, and then you give that to others, and they create whatever interpretation they want to create off of your particular piece of art. And I think that ends up being so useless in a lot of ways, right? Like, there are legitimate ideas that I feel like we should communicate to one another. There are so many fantastic stories, both screenwriting, both stories for the screen and novels and short stories and all sorts of things, that communicate very intentionally important ideas, important themes, important philosophical viewpoints to the people who are taking those stories in, to readers or audiences and these sorts of things. And to suggest that a writer should organically create without any sort of learned skill set, without any sort of understanding of principles, without any sort of understanding how storytelling and art and these sorts of things work, you are supposed to create a masterpiece that has no intentional meaning, and then suddenly all of these other people are going to come in, read or watch your story, and then suddenly there's going to be all this meaning but different meaning for different people. And it's all going to be unintentional, right? And so you're just going to accidentally stumble into a masterpiece. I just reject this idea completely. I think what happens is we have associated principles and rules with bad mainstream storytelling, right? Just because a story is well structured does not mean it's good. And I will be the first to say that, right? And I was one of those people. I'm sure that there's a lot of people that are like this, where you get obsessed with story structure and you feel like story structure is the most important part of your story. And you have to know every beat perfectly. And you have to go through and restructure and outline and restructure and re-outline and restructure and re-outline. And then you just do that until you want to slam your head against the table because you can never create this perfect masterpiece of structure, right? And then what happens is I think a lot of people either they go through that period and then reject structure altogether, or they watch sort of mainstream kind of blockbuster films and they point to them and say, oh, they're formulaic, and the reason that they're not good is because they are just based upon this westernized idea of structure. And so then they go ahead and they make these experimental films, and then what happens is they have no thematic intention in these films, no philosophical intention in these films, no understanding of the skill set of writing and of storytelling, no understanding of character change, no understanding of cause and effect, no understanding of structure, no understanding of how to actually create competing viewpoints in a story. And then you create a piece of garbage that they then, send to film festivals, and other people who know nothing about storytelling tell them, oh, wow, it's so deep and meaningful and impactful. But then nobody outside of that group wants to read or watch this story. And they say, oh, that's because everyone else is stupid. That's because people, they just love their Marvel films. They're not smart enough to understand my art, right? And so then you just develop this narcissism about the fact that you made one experimental film and you think you're David Lynch, And that's the thing too, right? People look at David Lynch, as this icon of experimental filmmaking, which he is, but you watch David Lynch films, And there are themes, there are ideas that he is talking about. David Lynch is being intentional in his own way, in the sense that he is being intentional in communicating particular and specific ideas in a format that is not like, traditional dramatic narrative. And so, yes, you can not use, what is considered traditional or westernized story structure, but this idea that you can create like truly great and impactful art without being intentional about what you're saying, I just don't think this is the case at all. And I think that what people do is they hide. I think people like the idea that storytelling is this enigma that they can't ever do any better at, because I think it makes them feel. I feel like it makes people feel better about the fact that they haven't really done the hard work of developing a skill set. They'd much rather create something and have their buddies, give them a pat on the back and tell them how deep and wonderfully intellectual they are, rather than actually creating something that's impactful for people and important. And so for me, when you look at other forms of art, right? Like if you look at sculpting, for example, if you look at, I spoke about this a little bit on my main YouTube channel, but this idea of, Michelangelo creating David, the sculpture David, like, you don't think there's skill involved in that? You don't think that he spent time understanding proportions and dimensions and, how to correctly, use the tools of sculpting? I'm not a sculptor, I don't know all of the intricacies, but the point remains, right? The idea is this was a person who took a lot of time intentionally honing a craft to then create things that were beautiful and meaningful to others. And then people will say, oh, well, that's a different form of art. That's not like storytelling. I disagree completely. I think it's very, very similar, right? You're maybe communicating different ideas and you're communicating a different thing, but ultimately you are communicating through art, right? I think the idea that the reason that we have art, in my opinion, is because we are trying to communicate ideas to each other where our regular ways of communication fail us. And that's probably, and to be fair, that's definitely it's an oversimplification of what art is. But I think this is a very important element of art. I'll just say that, where we are trying to communicate these human things that we can't necessarily fit into words, because words are something that, they're constructed by, language. The English language, for example, the words that I'm giving to you now is constructed by people, by us, having this language that moves and grows and changes. And it means that there's a lot of gaps and a lot of problems in our ability to correctly communicate. We do not have a perfect ability to communicate. And because of that, we then go to other avenues to communicate these very deep ideas that we're trying to get to, that we're struggling with inside our heads, but we have problems communicating it to others, and so then we create pieces of art. One of those art forms being storytelling. And I think that because of that, I think there is objectivity to this process. Are you able to say this is a rule always? No, you're not. But what I would say is that, what I don't want to say here is that, like, there are rules, but rules are meant to be broken. I hate when people say that. I hate that. I despise people saying that. When you're saying that, you're just saying words. What do you mean? Oh, rules are meant to be broken. Okay, your Act 1 turning point starts on page 42 instead of page 30, and you're going to talk to me about rules are meant to be broken. Stop. There are principles to art, and there are principles to storytelling. And when you are trying to communicate philosophical ideas, when you are trying to communicate themes, when you are trying to examine the human condition and then present that to another person to impact them emotionally and intellectually and spiritually, there are ways of operating, because human beings work in a way, right? Like there are rules and principles to how our minds work, right? So because there are rules and principles to how our minds work, how our thought patterns work, how we emotionally experience and logically deduce, there are patterns to that. And so there are patterns to how we can correctly and intelligently communicate ideas to other people. And so I reject this idea that there are no principles and there are no rules and you can do whatever you want. Clearly no one believes this, right? We all end up in this gray area between completely following all structural or character or conflict or momentum rules at all time and completely abandoning them. There is always, we do sit in this gray. And I would also say that part of, this comes back to the idea of language and the fact that we have our rules and principles around, like, about art based in a language that is imperfect. Based in a language where we are not holistically able to comprehend every single element of what we mean when we say your story should operate kind of like this, right? Really what we have is we can look back, this is what Joseph Campbell did, is he looked back and was like, okay, well, it seems like there's a pattern of archetypal myths that work in this way. And so it seems like there's a type of story that is present again and again that we can collectively, as a human race, view and understand and gain from, right? And that's not every story, but that is a main, that's something, that's kind of how we are doing our best to create principles, right? And so I think that, again, so this is why on my YouTube channel I focused so heavily on trying to figure out the deepest version of the rule, right? Because what I don't want to do, if you look at certain screenwriting books and certain rules and story principles, I think it's Save the Cat, if I'm correct, where in Save the Cat, Blake Snyder is giving you, like, okay, page 10, this should happen. Page 20, this should happen. Then you're going to have this happen right after. And then you're going to have this, and then you're going to have this on page blank. You're going to, and what that does is that is like the most surface level version of the rules. And so then what happens is people look at the most surface level version of the rules and they say, oh, well, this isn't how stories work. Of course not. This was a guy who's trying to tell you how to get a screenplay sold, right? That was the intention of Save the Cat, right? How to help you market and sell a screenplay in a world of Hollywood. That was the point of that book. Blake Snyder is not trying to give you the core element of universal storytelling and the human condition wrapped up in this book about saving a cat. That's not what he's trying to do. And so I understand what he's trying to do. There's a place for what he's trying to do. And there's things that you can gain from that. But to pin ideas like Blake Snyder's and then say, this means that all principles and all rules we throw out the window, it's all useless, and we make experimental films that nobody gets until we die, is just so stupid. And so that's why I've tried to focus on my YouTube channel on the most deep version of a particular principle. That's why I have been focused on philosophical conflict and how philosophical conflict relates so heavily to all of these other elements of your story, right? Because you can look at a story like David Lynch, stories made by David Lynch, and see his philosophical conflict. And maybe I'll go into that someday in a YouTube video or on a podcast episode. But you can do that. And so the point is that he's making decisions based upon that. And when you can do that, then you can start building back up, Like you could create a fantastic story starting with philosophical conflict, understanding your characters, and then plugging that into like a Blake Snyder beat sheet, and you could have a great story. You could. The problem is people start with the beat sheet, and they start with this sort of extremely surface level version of how to tell a story, and then they make something bad, and then they wonder why they made a terrible surface level story with a surface level guideline. So the idea is to try to get as deep as possible with what those principles are. And the deeper you can get on the principles, the better your story is going to be. Because there are principles. The problem is we fill our brains with garbage that isn't what the principles are. And so when you look at philosophical conflict, then you can start talking about, okay, how does that actually relate to a story? And then you can look and say, okay, well, there's different types of stakes and different levels of conflict within a story. You have, external conflict, and you have internal conflict, and you have philosophical conflict. Okay, and then how does that relate to a story? Well, now you have characters, and you have character growth and change. Well, why do you have character growth and change? Well, we can look at the rhythm of the world and the universe and our understanding of how life operates, where we see the world in a state of growth and change and an equilibrium and conflict. And then you can start to say, okay, well, how does that rhythm of growth and change and this rhythm of chaos and order, how do you then apply that to the momentum of story conflict? And then you can look at something which, like Dan Harmon's Story Circle, which people love to remind me that it is very similar to Campbell's Hero's Journey. And while it is, in certain ways, it's not the same, because he's coming down to what the core rhythm is, right? Campbell's looking at archetypes. Harmon's Circle is looking at the rhythm of conflict and momentum, and how this rhythm of conflict, momentum, and change is innate within the human condition. And that's how we begin to base our structure on something deeper than making sure that your inciting incident happens on page 10. And so, that's what I think. There is intention to your story. There should be. You will never catch me making an experimental film. And I would love at some point, I consistently have conversations with people, and I have conversations with people who have made experimental anti-plot films, and, they talk about the benefits of those, and I know people who have benefited greatly from these sort of anti-plot films. And so I'm not wanting to sit here and say that I have everything figured out. I don't. But what I will say is you have to begin to take stances to develop what your viewpoint is so that you can actually create stories that you're proud of. If you're constantly in this place of, who knows, we can never know, that sort of agnostic view on it is so unhelpful. I like to be pragmatic about things. I like to be practical. That's why I created practicalscreenwriting.com and created the practical screenwriting course, is because I like practicality. I like I like when things stop being ideas and things stop being people sitting around a room and talking, and I like when they begin to be real. And when people start taking action based upon what they are talking about. And so you can talk all day about what are story principles and whether or not they work, but at some point you're going to have to sit down and write a screenplay if you want to be a screenwriter. And when you do that, you're going to realize real fast that, oh, maybe there are some principles here that I need to follow. If I want to communicate an idea correctly, maybe there are some things that would help me out, and maybe I need to learn more about these principles. And so, I would say somebody who has made experimental films or has written experimental screenplays or has written anti-plot stories, novels or whatever, that's not the person I'm really speaking to, because they are on a journey of understanding what kind of stories they're trying to make. And if you're a person who's writing anti-plot stories, continue. That's fine. As long as you are writing them, and as long as you are committing to understanding what your viewpoint is on storytelling and how it operates and how you want your stories to operate. But if you're a person who's never written a screenplay and you're talking about how the rules don't matter, stop. Write a screenplay, That's so frustrating to me. People talking about story principles as if there's a problem with them, and then they've never written anything. It's like you don't even know what you're talking about. You've never tried. You never realized that you have no idea what you're doing on page 30 when you're just writing and writing and writing, and then suddenly you realize that, oh, you need a little bit more than just your organic mind. You kind of need some things to help you out here, some skill set, some hours put in, some rules, some principles. So, and people think that skill set and building a craft, they think that destroys self-expression, but I just don't think that at all. People think that once you start learning about rules and principles, you stop being able to be unique or original, and I just don't think so. I think what makes you unique and original is being a thinker and working on developing your own viewpoint. And if you are seriously committed to working on developing your own viewpoint and then bringing that viewpoint into your storytelling, you're going to have no problem with originality. I wouldn't even worry about ever being original. I would worry about being a thinker that's actually serious and thinking critically and developing what your particular worldview is. If you are consistently doing that, I don't think you will ever have an issue with originality. I really don't. So that's what I think. This is. I hope that makes sense to you, and I really believe that story principles are valuable. Skill set is valuable, and your own ability to think critically and make decisions is valuable. And when you can put all that together and do that consistently, then you can create something that's truly fantastic. Now, if you want to listen to another episode right now, came out the same day as this episode, you can join the Patreon, first link below, to get another episode. I'm doing 4 extra episodes every month in the Patreon. You can also get into the Discord, where you can submit some topics or questions to be talked about on the podcast. So I hope to see you inside, and I will see you next time.